Yes.
So Moore's law, as you all know, is based on an observation made by Gordon Moore in 1965. And his observation, this was an empirical observation, base was said that the number of transistors on a chip roughly doubles every 2 years. And we have seen over multiple technology nodes as transistor sizes have shrunk. This law has roughly held. That 2-year timeline changed to about 18 months in the 1990s. And Gordon Moore himself, he was at Fairchild Semiconductor when he made that observation. And he went on to found Intel. Okay. So for those of you who are interested, I have included a link to the original paper written by Gordon Moore in which he laid out this law. Okay. So now the first question to ask is, what actually achieves this kind of scaling? So it largely comes from process improvements, at least until about 16 and 14 nanometers. Most of the scaling has come through process improvements, and this is because transistor sizes have kept reducing. So the transistor size in the 1940s, when the transistor was first invented, was in millimeters, and today, if you see, cutting edge transistors are less than 10 nanometers. Okay. So this, for those of you who understand how a transistor works, this dimension actually refers to the thickness of the gate. Okay. And today, the gate of a transistor is a few atoms thick. Then the other factor, in addition to transistor size, was the addition of more metal layers, which has allowed to connect transistors across longer distances. And then more currently, we see things like 2.5 and 3D integration and the use of FinFET transistors, which are really three-dimensional transistors compared to CMOS, which has enabled further process improvements. Okay? And manufacturing reliably at smaller geometries is much harder. And the larger your chip die size is relative to the scale of your transistor, the harder it is to also increase the yield. And that is typically what we mean by manufacturing reliably. Basically, a large percentage of the transistors that you manufacture should work. Right? And if you actually think about the problems that can happen with transistors that are a few atoms thick, right? It's amazing actually that electronics works at all. Now, in the current generation, silicon is becoming more and more commoditized. So, having area on a chip is not that expensive. And you can see it, right? It is becoming much easier to buy a laptop with a large amount of RAM and so on. So scaling in terms of the, kind of applications that you can put in a given surface area continues not just because of improvements in the process, but because of a huge amount of innovation in architecture and system level design and software programmability. Right? And that's what allows us to keep on efficiently designing in smaller and smaller geometries. So any questions here, especially questions related to some of the questions in the quiz?
Ma'am, one question related to Moore's law.
Yeah.
Ma'am, is there any limit to, like, for example, when we say that the number of transistors double? So have we achieved any limit then, for example, like now it's the like threshold, now it can't double anymore. So does there exist any kind of limit?
Yeah, so, for as long as I have been working in the industry, I have heard this, people say that Moore's law is dead. Scaling will not continue, right? But somehow we have seen that, human ingenuity finds a way. So, for example, around, 160 and 100 nanometers and all, there was a lot of worry about how we would be able to etch. So basically, when you manufacture a chip, you have to, it's like developing a photograph, so you have to etch the transistors onto the silicon substrate, right? And this etching is done by light. It's done using a mask, which exposes the parts that have to be etched out, and it's done by light. Now, a lot of the complication at lower geometry comes because you have to etch out features which are much smaller than the wavelength of the light. So if you remember your 12th grade physics, right? There are all kinds of optical interference effects that happen, so interference and diffraction will result in a rectangle that you want to etch, not actually looking like a rectangle on the chip when you actually etch it out. And so that means, all your estimates of capacitance and resistance and all will not be accurate anymore. Right? So, for this, actually, there has been a whole lot of innovation in how we do manufacturing. So we now use extreme ultraviolet light ray lithography. Design rules have changed so that, we ensure that the geometries are such that they can be manufactured. There is a lot of, technology now to how a mask is processed. So basically, when you do a layout and the layout is in terms of rectangles, actually, before that layout is used to generate a mask, the mask is processed. So the rectangles actually are changed to be non-rectangular shapes so that when they are etched, they look like rectangles. So, a lot of innovation in many areas has basically made it possible to manufacture. So yes, we keep hearing these, questions about when scaling will stop. It hasn't stopped yet, so very hard to predict. Let's see what happens going forward. Does that answer your question?
Sure, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Very satisfactory.
So now let's start by looking at where FPGAs stand on the computing spectrum. Okay, and this is very important to understand why we use FPGAs at all in the industry and why they're used as accelerators specifically, which is the focus of this course. Right? So Professor Suresh in the first lecture had given a bit of a glimpse of FPGAs versus ASICs and what some of the differences are there. So here, if you think of the computing spectrum, it's an entire spectrum with CPUs on one side. Right? You can think of a CPU as something that is, completely programmable at runtime. It's very, very general purpose. And it has a relatively mature software stack. So all the programming is done at a very, very high level. Okay? So, if you think about the entire stack on a CPU, you have an OS, and on top of that, you have, complex software applications, and then you program in those applications. Right? Now, for the other end of the spectrum is basically an ASIC. And the ASIC, so now an ASIC is the absolute opposite of general purpose. So it is a custom built chip to carry out a very, very specific functionality. Okay. Now, why would you custom build a chip? So the reason to do it is because you get much higher performance and lower power. And that's because the only functionality that you put on the chip is the one that you need. Right? And you don't need to add extra features to make it possible to do, a wide variety of things. Right? Now, FPGAs come somewhere in the middle. And so do GPUs and GPGPUs and, DSPs like those built by Texas Instruments and Analog Devices. They all come at different points on the spectrum in terms of how they are programmed and what is their power performance trade-off. Okay. So if you look at FPGAs in particular, they are programmable at runtime in the field, right? And they are actually programmed by writing to memory bits on the chip. So by writing ones and zeros to memory which is distributed throughout the chip, you basically program the FPGA to take on a specific functionality in its logic blocks and specific interconnections between those logic blocks. Okay. Now, obviously, it is very hard to think of a user programming a multi-million transistor chips by thinking of ones and zeros and loading it onto the chip, right? So there is actually a software stack that allows you to do this. Right? And the software stack for FPGAs has evolved as the FPGAs themselves have evolved. So if you read that paper by Dr. Trimberger, you would have seen some of that, right? So the very early FPGAs could be programmed relatively manually. It was easy to place and route it by hand. And as they became more complex, and the designs also became more complex, there's an entire software tool chain now that takes a design written in a higher level language like Verilog or VHDL, and then, generates a bit stream at the end of it, which programs the chip to actually perform that function. Okay? Now, the software stack is evolving in the sense that, the level of abstraction at which we can program these devices is now getting more and more abstract. So there are now, built-in libraries, and this is true of pretty much any FPGA vendor. It's not just specific to Xilinx where I work. And, so you'll see that there are built-in libraries, and you can, assemble blocks of IP together to build a design. Right? You can now program in higher level languages such as C or C++, and we'll see some more detail later on in this lecture. You can, program through MATLAB, for example. And, the software stack is now evolving so that in some of the latest tools which are available, some of which you will use in the course of your project, you can actually, plug in code that runs on an FPGA into an existing software framework. It may be GStreamer or FFmpeg if you're doing video. It may be TensorFlow or Caffe if you're doing some kind of machine learning application, okay? And so on and so forth. Okay? So basically on the spectrum, FPGAs lie somewhere in the middle with regard between CPUs and ASICs with regard to performance and power. Okay? And that is the whole premise of acceleration. So even your laptops today, right, they actually have accelerators. They have accelerators to do graphics, right? And that's done on a GPU. So GPU is a chip which is with an architecture which is customized to do graphics very, very efficiently, right? And any graphics operation that the CPU has to do is offloaded onto a GPU. Now, the huge advantage that FPGAs bring when you want to actually accelerate something is that, you can program it to take any function at runtime, right? So it's not custom programmed upfront for only a specific kind of application. So this gives it enormous flexibility in taking on all kinds of workloads, right? Of course, there are trade-offs here. So if you had to do a graphics workload on an FPGA, for example, it would not be as efficient as it would be on a GPU. But for many other applications, you'll see that the trade-off between power, performance, and cost is such that it actually is beginning to make sense for more and more applications. And so if you, read technical articles or, magazine, look at IEEE Spectrum or, some of these more technical forums, you'll actually see a lot of articles today about accelerating on FPGAs. In the last maybe 6-7 years itself, practically every conference has a track on accelerating applications on an FPGA. And this is because of the enormous flexibility. So what are some of the markets served by FPGAs? So unlike ASICs, which are custom built for a specific application, and CPUs, which tend to be used in servers, right? FPGAs are serving a very wide variety of markets. And this ranges all the way from aerospace and defense through ASIC emulation and prototyping. So this is, for ASIC vendors, when you build an ASIC chip and you want to test the functionality before the chip is actually taped out or manufactured, you do this by, actually emulating the functionality of that ASIC on an FPGA. And then you run your tests on it and make sure that there are no functional errors. And if you have you may have a software stack on top of this as well, in which case you actually prototype the way your entire system works. So that's emulation and prototyping. In automotive and ADAS now, we see FPGAs being used for bigger and bigger chunks of functionality. They are being used in broadcast and AV applications. In consumer electronics, like set-top boxes, flat panel TVs. If you have a Panasonic TV, it has chips in it. In the data center, we are seeing a wider and wider use of FPGAs, both in compute, in storage, and in networking. And then a variety of industrial, scientific, and medical applications, ranging all the way from robotics to machinery, right? And then video and image processing, and wired and wireless communication in base stations and routers and the like. So this actually initially was a very big market in the 90s, and that is why the use of FPGAs actually took off because of the expansion of communication. And now, of course, there are a number of other killer applications that are helping it expand further. So one thing to note is that when we talk about an FPGA, we don't just talk about, it's not just a single device, it's actually a family of devices at any given technology node. And because these devices serve a wide range of markets, you'll find that the architecture and the composition of these devices changes depending on the market that they serve. So for example, you may find in different devices, depending on the market that they serve, the mix of DSPs versus generic logic may be different. You may find certain devices which have a lot of memory access required to bring in data to the chip. For example, video processing. They will actually, those chips will have a specific controller to access HBM memory quickly. You may have a different flavor of memory components of different size and different number depending on what your target applications are. And then, based on the area of use, some of these architectures will also have specialized hard blocks. For example, if it's communications block, you may have a forward error correction code. You have PCIe on typically every device, but the number and range varies. You have transceivers, and this to bring data in and out of the chip, and the speed of these transceivers varies a lot depending on the target market. You have memory controllers, network on a chip in some of our latest devices, and so on. So let's take a deeper look at FPGAs versus ASICs. Okay. So we had this question in the quiz, and I hope all of you looked up what NRE cost is. Professor Suresh also mentioned it in the first lecture. So this is the non-recurring engineering cost. So that is actually the cost required to develop the chip, right? And the more general purpose your chip is, the easier it is to recover this development cost by selling a large volume of the chip. So if you look at things like CPUs or consumer electronics, right, chips which are used in your cell phone chipsets, they're sold at very, very large volumes. Right? So the cost of developing that chip can be amortized over a very large volume. Right? Now, FPGAs have a lower NRE cost because they are more generic. Right? And you can actually amortize that cost over a wide range of applications. And so that means, even if somebody wants to buy an FPGA, it is cost effective at lower volumes because we are able to sell it at a price that amortizes the development cost of the chip itself. Does that make sense? Any questions here? Okay. And if you read Dr. Trimberger's paper, you'll see in this graph with a crossover point, and it was there in the slides for lecture 1 as well. Was there a question?
Yeah, ma'am. Hello. I'm audible.
Yeah, please tell me.
Yeah, ma'am. In the previous slide, you showed like the market which FPGA captures. In that, at certain point, the applications get saturated, ma'am. Like in the consumer electronics or in the different markets which you showed, that application gets saturated. Means we will pointing out to a one application only. So why we are not going to the ASIC and why we are sticking to the FPGAs only? Because FPGAs are more, as you said, like gives enormous flexibility and things.
Correct. So that's a very good question actually. So what you'll find is FPGAs are also used in, FPGAs are also used in bring this slide back. In many of these markets, right, you'll find that FPGAs are sometimes used for the first spin of a product. So, and this is very common in communications applications and even broadcast and all. So the first spin of a product will typically be on an FPGA. And once the design has been ironed out and you're very sure it's working, very often customers will actually harden them to form an ASIC. Right? So a mature product basically, if the volume is large enough, will be switched to an ASIC. But there will be many applications for which the volume is never large enough to make that transition. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now, what are some of the advantages of FPGAs versus ASICs? The big advantage of ASICs, of course, is you get much better power and much better performance. Now, the advantage with an FPGA is because it is programmed in the field, right? You can correct any functional errors in your design without respinning the chip. And respinning the chip is both very time consuming because you have to wait for it to go to the foundry and come back. And it's also expensive. And the way foundries work is, unless you're a major customer like, an Apple, Samsung or something, you typically will get there's a shuttle and you'll get a slot on the shuttle. So you have to wait for, to get a slot before your chip goes off, gets manufactured and comes back, right? And it's also very expensive because for every respin, you have to regenerate the masks. And because of all these factors that I mentioned before, right, the mask requires a lot of processing. And the process of getting to a layout itself is quite time consuming for ASICs. So that is, both very expensive. So that is a big advantage of using an FPGA. Then in addition, if you look at the design cycle itself, timing closure is much easier. So the clock distribution network is built in. Interconnect is buffered by design. So in ASICs, buffers have to actually be inserted. If you don't insert buffers, delay on a line will start becoming quadratic as length increases. So you have to insert buffers at regular intervals to make sure that the delay remains linear with respect to length. So, and that is taken care of by design in an FPGA because there is a fixed interconnect architecture. And then there are many second order effects related to layout, like, crosstalk and so on, which are becoming more and more impactful on delay at smaller geometries. And all these factors are margined into the software tools. So a designer doesn't have to worry about them when, closing on timing. And this becomes a big part of the whole timing closure process on an ASIC. So if you look, we'll take a minute and look at the two flows here. So if you look at an ASIC flow, right, typically you would start with HDL, you would do behavioral simulation, right? Then you would do synthesis, you would try to get some kind of sign off, right? At this point, you would have to do DFT insertion because you have to ultimately test your chip, right? Whereas here, this is a pre-manufactured chip, so you don't have to worry about DFT. It's taken care of at the time when the chip is manufactured. You have to do a floor planning because timing closure is more complex, right? You have to do a place and route. Right? And then, you do your static timing. You would have to run extraction to verify that everything works, even with second and third order effects from the layout. Here, the steps are a lot more simple. Once you have the RTL and you're satisfied with its simulated behavior, you just take it through the tools, run, synthesis, place and route. Of course, there are iterations required here to hand off, but it is less complex because of all these reasons. A lot of the complexity of closing on timing is taken care of by being built in or margined into the chip or the software. The other thing is that, because this is a pre-built chip, right? You're programming it at runtime. Validating designs directly in hardware is possible. And in fact, you'll see many FPGA customers don't actually validate their design through simulation. Many of them won't even have a test bench set up. They'll just directly bring it to the board and run tests. And validating in hardware is much faster than running simulation, because you're running it on the actual chip, right? Compared to, if you're simulating, you're actually trying to run the behavior on a CPU, which is a lot slower. The other factor is that you can do any functional upgrades in the field. So if I had let's say I had a communication protocol, which is evolving, right? Then I can, upgrade it in the field as the protocol evolves, because all I need to do is change the design and reprogram the chip. Whereas if I had an ASIC, I would have to respin the ASIC to handle any unexpected upgrades. And in today's world, where especially, if you look at applications in the area of machine learning and deep learning, right? Video, audio processing, speech recognition, right? All these algorithms are changing really, really fast. Right? And so using FPGAs to, accelerate these kinds of applications allows you to adapt to changing algorithms, changing workloads, while at the same time getting better performance and power than you would if you were purely doing it on a CPU server or a GPU server. Okay. Any questions here? So let's look now at what's inside an FPGA. So for the next few slides, I'm going to refer specifically to Xilinx FPGAs, but the basic principles are very, very similar to FPGAs from any vendor. Right? There will be some differences in terms of the mix of blocks or specific blocks used or how they are laid out, but the basic principles are very, very translatable. So in this diagram, you can see there is a vendor board. Okay? And this is a board that you would use to run an entire application. Okay? So this board has an FPGA. It has some memory. Right? It plugs into some kind of network controller, maybe a disk through SATA, maybe connects to a CPU host through PCIe. Okay? And this cartoon shows you some of the elements which are there in an FPGA. We'll go through it in more detail in the later slides. So let's look at the I/O interfaces first. So the I/O interfaces are very important because So the I/O interfaces are very important because that's what connects the FPGA to the outside world. Right? And if you cannot bring data in and out of the chip efficiently, that severely limits what you can do with the silicon real estate that you have. So basically, the I/O interfaces provide access to the PCIe bus, to SATA ports, to any networking or other specialized devices. And you'll see in addition to these I/O banks, which we call IOB, you also have serial transceivers. So a transceiver is a transmit-receive pair. And what it allows you to do is, if you have a lot of data coming in, you serialize the data and bring it in very fast onto the chip. So these work very fast. Our fastest transceivers are at 100 gig. So you can bring data in and out very fast. So, you bring it in serially and you may parallelize it here if need be in whatever format you would require. So, and the arrangement of IOs could be ring IO, which means the IOs are found on the periphery of the device, or they could also be columnar IO. So Xilinx typically uses columnar I/O. So you'll find, if you look at the floor plans of any of our chips, you'll see columns for I/Os in the chip. And one advantage of using columnar I/O is that it's very easy to then connect to logic which is inside the chip. So now let's take a look at the processing components. Okay. So as Professor Suresh mentioned in the first lecture, so an FPGA really works based on the premise that you have this logic block which can be configured to perform any Boolean function. Right? So it consists, among other things, the configurable logic block or CLB consists of lookup tables. This is really the key invention that enabled the FPGA. Okay? So you can think of it as a stack of muxes, right, that can be programmed to perform any specific function. And you saw a picture related to that in the first lecture, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But you can look up and see exactly how it would be done. It's very, very straightforward. So initially, the oldest FPGAs started with 4 input, and some of them even had 2 input lookup tables. Right? Now, today, you'll find most FPGAs have figured out that 6 input LUTs are kind of the optimal size. And that is because of the kind of functions that we end up using in typical applications. So a deeper analysis of the kind of functions and the way they are synthesized into logical Boolean operations seems to suggest that 5 to 6 inputs actually is more than adequate. So the Xilinx FPGA has a 6 input LUT, which can also be configured as a smaller LUT if need be. Now the CLB itself consists of a lot more than just a LUT. So if you see, if you look at the middle picture, which I'm showing here, this kind of shows a cartoon of the logic in the CLB. So you can see 8 LUTs, right? And there is a chain of multiplexers, and there are 2 FPGAs. Okay, and here I'm 2 flip-flops, and here I have zoomed in to show one of these LUTs. So you can see that this LUT, you can see 2 inputs highlighted. So this LUT will take 6 inputs in and produce 1 output. And you have the option to program it as a 5 input LUT, in which case you would take the 05 output, or a 6 input LUT, in which case you would take the 06 output. And then you have the option through this mux to access the flop directly, either of the flops. And there are other inputs to the mux as well, which include carry logic and wide multiplexers, which are not shown here. So the carry chain is shown in the rightmost figure. So if you see, this is basically a very simple carry propagate generate block. And this is used to allow us to implement very fast adders. So if I had to add, 2 operands, you could actually program the carry chain in the LUT, like a cascade of carry chains could implement your adder. And each carry chain block can do an 8-bit carry. So any questions here? And, you will find that exactly what lies inside this configurable logic block. The very basic programming building block will be a little different from one FPGA family to another. It will be a little different from one vendor to another. So if you look at Intel's FPGAs, Intel acquired Altera. So Intel is the other large FPGA player. If you look at Intel FPGAs, you'll see a slightly different configuration of logic blocks. The LUTs they use are a little bit different. The ratio of LUTs to flops, or the way muxes and carries are used will be a little bit different. But the basic principle is the same. Right? This is a logic block that takes in a large number of inputs and is able to be programmed to perform any input function. And the way it is programmed is, so the programming memory is not shown here, but basically underlying the FPGA logic, there are also transistors in the form of SRAM cells, which are there in every block. And there are separate inputs to program those SRAM cells. Now, those inputs are not accessible to designers. They're used only when you program the cells, right? And that's what actually tells this LUT what function to perform out of all the possible 6 inputs. They are also used to program the mux and therefore the interconnection inside this block. Now, another related processing component that you'll find in modern FPGAs is a DSP block. So the DSP block has, and I have a detailed diagram in the next slide. So the DSP block will allow you to do operations which are very important for signal processing. So it allows you to do efficient adds or multiplication or multiply accumulate. So that's important. And then these PLLs are basically related to clock. We'll get deeper into it when we talk about clocking later. So if you look at the DSP block, this is what it looks like. So the block itself has, it has 4 flops, and it has a mux, which allows you to decide whether you use a pre-adder or not. And it has a 27x18 2's complement multiplier, right? And then it has a 48-bit accumulator unit. And you can actually cascade multiple DSPs to build 96-bit or larger accumulators or adders or counters. And then it has a SIMD unit, which will allow you to do add, subtract, accumulate in SIMD. If you're not familiar with SIMD, we will cover it in one of the later lectures. Then there is a 48-bit logic unit, which allows you to do any bitwise operation. Right? And then because this does a lot of arithmetic, we have a pattern detector, which will handle things like overflow, underflow, terminal counts. And then there are these registers and bypass buses, which allow you to cascade all these DSPs. And so that allows you to do, larger functions. So if you had to do a full filter or you had to compose a number of operations to get a bigger operation, you can very easily do that. Okay. Now in this course, right, you will actually not see a lot of the underlying hardware in the FPGA because you're going to be programming it at a very abstract level. But, if you actually want to correlate what is going on, right, all the way down to what is happening in the hardware on the board, it's actually nice to be able to understand some of these aspects. The other component that you find in an FPGA is memory. Okay. So this figure shows block RAM. And the block RAM is basically memory which is there on fabric. And it is used as to do any kind of storage that you need in between computes. Right? And if you had a memory block, it could be implemented as a set of block RAMs together. Right? So they would share an address bus. And the other aspect that we have for storage is shift registers, which can be implemented using, queues with the flops in the CLB. We can also program our LUTs to become shift registers, and in certain cases to be, they can be programmed as memory blocks to actually store data. That's called distributed memory in our terminology, or DRAM. So you can see that this allows a very rich level of memory hierarchy. So later FPGA architectures have even bigger memory blocks called ultra-RAMs. We'll come to it in a couple of slides. So this is what a block RAM block looks like. So this shows a 36 kilobit block RAM in dual port configuration. Okay. So you can see, this allows your, this is port A and this is port B. And you can see the data coming in. You can see the address coming in. This tells you whether you're writing or reading. Right? There are other ways to configure this to include error correction codes if needed. You can actually configure the mode, read-write mode of the block RAM. And if you see these buses coming in, they are to cascade multiple RAMs together to form a bigger RAM. And that cascading is what is shown in the figure on the right. So you can see that your data in 0 comes here. It's cascaded out. It goes through this. It's cascaded out again. It comes out. Then we also have Ultra RAMs. These are available in UltraScale Plus devices onwards. So an Ultra RAM is a single RAM block with 288 kilobits of storage. So it allows you to create a 4K into 72 single clock synchronous memory. Okay. So you can actually have 72 4K memories in here. Or you could configure it to any other subset of this that you wish. And this figure, I've added a little bit of the additional logic also, so you can see how you get in and out of the memory. Okay? So you can see there are registers that allow you to bring the data and the address in. Okay? And similarly, there are registers that allow you to take it out, and you can see there is an error control code encoder and a decoder here. So finally, a very, very critical part of the FPGA is the interconnect. So interconnect actually sits in the form of tiles which come between the logic blocks. So they are shown here in blue. Okay? And conceptually, you can think of each interconnect tile as a crossbar. So basically, before programming, you have the option to connect anything, any line coming in to any line coming out, right, in any direction. And these can be programmed again by writing to muxes here and memory bits, right? SRAM cells again. And these muxes basically choose which parts in the crossbar you take. So this figure shows you basically, see, this is programmed to, this route is programmed to use these wires. The red route is programmed to use these wires. The blue route is programmed to use these wires. So therefore, the flexibility for programming is not only in the logic, but also in the connectivity between the logic. And that's what makes FPGAs so rich and flexible, right? So to get back to one of the questions in the quiz, so it is actually this development of using SRAM cells to configure the FPGA, which has made it possible to make the architecture very flexible. You see, previous generations, when they used PLAs, right, it was always an and or array, and that was what was used to switch, right? And that becomes very area intensive as you try to connect more and more blocks. So this use of SRAMs allowed you to create a hierarchy of interconnect. It allowed you to program blocks separately, and that is really what allowed the FPGA architecture to scale very easily. So now routing architectures themselves, they are typically very, very heterogeneous. Okay, so the routing architecture, by routing architecture, I mean, the number of routes of different lengths which are available in an FPGA. So, and that varies again from device to device and from vendor to vendor. So, while the early FPGAs actually had connections only between adjacent logic blocks, modern FPGAs will have connections between, so you'll have connections that go one block away. You'll have connections that go 2 blocks away. You'll have connections that allow you to go in an L shape. For example, you could go like this. You have longer connections that go, maybe 12 or 16 blocks away, and they're much faster. So the number of different types of interconnect is what we call the routing architecture. And by heterogeneous, I mean that you have a variety of lengths available. Now, this routing architecture is very critical both for congestion and performance. Right? And that's what I've tried to show with this figure here. So let's say, only if you are able to, pack your logic on the device and route it in the most efficient way, right, will you be able to meet your performance constraints. Right? So now, given a specific, let's say optimal packing of my logic, right? So if you see here, right, and if you think of it, the colored boxes are the ones which are used. So I have, not packed my logic very well into all the logic blocks. Right? You can see there are many empty blocks here. So I'm using a much larger area. Now here I've been able to pack it optimally. But if I don't have enough routing resources to be able to connect these logic blocks, there is no point in my packing. At the same time, it is expensive actually to be able to connect logic blocks. And the reason is, as technology scales, your routing does not scale at the same, in the same way that transistors scale. So actually transistors scale and become much faster and much smaller, but interconnect doesn't scale the same way. Okay, so you'll actually find, if you look at FPGA families, that the amount of logic that is packed in a block actually keeps increasing from one generation to the other. And that is because it's not easy to come down and connect to a transistor with an interconnect. So you try to connect larger and larger pieces of transistors together so that it is feasible for you to actually get to these blocks. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions here? This is a very important point actually, and a lot of time and energy is spent in coming up with the right routing architecture when you design the FPGA architecture itself.
Ma'am?
Yes.
At the end, the requirement is to get the right one, the right diagram.
Yes, correct.
But due to the technology that the interconnects are not scaling down, we might end up in this suboptimal thing.
You might, yes. If, for example, if you don't have the resources to connect these, right, then you may have to spread them out a little bit.
And is there any correlation with the SRAM size, ma'am? If we had more SRAM, then...
Which SRAMs are you talking about? Are you talking about the SRAMs which are used to program the device?
Yes, ma'am.
No, that is, so the SRAMs which are used to program the device are pretty small, really. So that does not end up being a gating factor.
As you told, like the SRAM were used to configure the FPGAs and the switch boxes.
Correct.
So if the size increases, the routes, the combinations also will increase.
Yes, but then, but the bottleneck here is not the size of the transistor. So I can easily, for a given route, I can easily pack in the number of transistors that I need to program it. What is difficult is to bring in, see, if I have to bring in a wire, right, a metal wire, and these chips are actually stacked, So it's one layer on top of the other. I'll try to send a video that you can look at to understand this a little better. So it's, one layer on top of the other, and the metal layers cannot be too thin. They're very, very hard to manufacture if they're too thin. If they become too thin, they'll actually break, and you'll get, opens in the middle of the chip. So your interconnect has to be of a certain thickness to come in, but your transistor becomes much, much smaller, right? This is true, especially of higher levels of interconnect. So if you want to have long wires, they come, higher metal layers, they end up having to be a bit bigger. Did that answer your question?
Okay, yes, ma'am.
I had a question. So regarding this DSPs, right? The 18 bits, is there any reason for the multipliers to be of such a bit width?
Typically, this comes from analysis actually. So we analyze the kind of functions that come in designs that run on our devices.
I see.
And then, and there is some trade-off, right? Because the DSP also occupies more real estate on the chip compared to logic block, and it is more specialized, right?
Correct.
So there is some trade-off in terms of the kind of functions that are implemented in the DSP, the area that is needed to build such a block. And what you give up if you had to do that, if you had to do that same function in pure logic, right? What
LUTs, right?
Yeah, in LUTs, what would you lose? How much area would you lose?
Correct. I see.
So that trade-off is what, and that's done through analysis. Basically, all this is empirical.
I see. Oh, thank you.
So so interconnect here is buffered by design, as I told you. So every mux that each of these. Oops, I keep pressing N instead of. So if you look at this, right? So every switch here is basically buffered. So this is a mux, and it actually also acts like a buffer. So that keeps the delay linear. And that is a very big advantage in FPGAs compared to ASICs, because you would actually have to figure out how to add buffers, and depending on where you add buffers, your delay changes. Right? And then each interconnect takes a specific number of hops. Right? So your delay here obviously varies with length. Another interesting thing to note is that the delay also depends on column crossings. So, if you had to take, now again here, the sizes are not to scale, but if I had to cross a CLB column, a CLB is typically much smaller than a block RAM or a DSP. So the delay that an interconnect takes to go across a CLB column is actually smaller than the delay it takes to go across a block RAM or a DSP column. Okay. And addition of heterogeneity in the FPGA architecture by using different kinds of blocks has made making certain types of functions more efficient, but it has also added a level of unpredictability to the routing, which adds a level of complexity to the algorithms that must be used in EDA tools to actually close on timing. The very early FPGAs were actually very, very regular and therefore very predictable. You know exactly how much delay you need to go from one point to another. So the more heterogeneous they get, the less predictable they are, and the more ASIC-like the timing closure problem becomes. So another interesting type of routing that you see in FPGAs, and this is very specific to Xilinx FPGAs, because we have a technology called SSIT, which has actually been around for I think at least the last 8-9 years. So this SSI technology allows you to connect routes between multiple dies without packaging them. So normally, if you take a die, you have to package it to be able to connect to the inputs. And the way this is done is through a very neat technology. So these are your dies which are on silicon, and they sit on a 65 nanometer silicon interposer layer. This is called an interposer because it interposes between the die and the substrate. And this is the package substrate. And there are basically vias that go all the way through the substrate, and they connect to these bumps. And this interposer, they connect to the package substrate through these bumps. And this interposer is what allows you to actually have, so they have, these things called micro bumps, which allow you to connect to a route here. And so you can take a route actually from one die to another. through this interposer. Now, because this is 65 nanometer, there is a limit to the number of such connections that you can have. But what this allows you to do is to bring out a chip which is very big, right? Because you can actually bring in multiple dies together. It also allows you to have a heterogeneous die. So for example, if you have analog components like transceivers, which are typically very noisy at smaller geometries, you could, have these at a slightly different geometry and actually integrate them with dies which are, more homogeneous. So this has allowed us to bring out very, very large FPGAs, which are used for emulation and prototyping largely. And, other companies, Intel has used a different technology to bring out larger FPGAs. They use chiplets. And we can insert, so a chiplet, instead of going through this, through silicon via and this interposer layer, a chiplet basically is a separate chip. It's a small die which sits between these, and there is a technology that allows you to, interconnect between these dies. So they put all these, these chips, different dies along with the chiplets in a single package. So this allows a different type of scaling. This is called 2.5D. And in memories today, you even see 3D scaling. That is, they actually stack silicon on top of silicon. That's another story. So last but not the least is, how do you bring clocks onto the chip? So for those of you who have done any kind of Verilog or hardware design, you know that it's very important to be able to bring in clocks. And to handle complex designs, you need to bring in actually a wide variety of clocks, because you have parts of your design that run at different speeds. Right? And that's what allows you to actually trade off between performance and power also. So the clocking resources on the FPGA are in the form of a pre-built but configurable clock tree. So we have both horizontal and vertical distribution tracks, if you see. So the term CR stands for a clock region. So the chip is divided into regions, right? And every region is serviced by horizontal and vertical clock routes. Right? Now the key when bringing in the clock is that, between any two flops, you should not have much skew. So basically the clock should come at the same time to both the beginning and the end of a critical path. So the way this is done is, this picture kind of shows it, the picture on the left. You basically use a common spine as far as you can go. And then you come in to the center of the clock region. Right? So until here, basically it's a common clock. Right? And then, you are able to balance your skew in this clock region by kind of spreading it out here. And, you can take detours in the routing if needed, or add buffers if needed to balance the skew. And again, this is all through programmable clocking blocks. Right? They are buffers and what we call MMCMs, or multi-clocking modules, which allow you to multiply or divide clocks. PLLs also are part of the clock network. They allow you to bring a clean clock signal in. So basically this, this is how the buffers look. So this is a kind of a logic diagram of these buffers. So you can see there's a clock buffer here. There is a distribution coming in here, right? This is a clock root. So the idea is that the clock buffer should be as balanced, the clock tree should be as balanced as possible to minimize skew. Any questions here? This is actually quite a complex topic. So it's hard to cover in just a few minutes. But even if you, take away the fact that when you design, your clock has to come without any skew to all the flops in your design, that itself is, I think, a very good takeaway.
But this is taken care of by the tools, right? When we do the design, they try to
That's
do
right. That's right. That's right. So the tools take care of it. So the difference between FPGAs and ASICs is that in an ASIC, the tool would actually have to synthesize the entire clock tree. Whereas on an FPGA, it is kind of partially done for you by laying out these resources here. So it's more you have to decide which branch of the clock tree to take.
Yes.
And clock tree synthesis, again, is a very, very time-consuming step in the whole ASIC flow. And what is the right place at which to do it? There's a lot of variations and a lot of complexity there. So now, so far we looked at FPGAs which looked like this, right? They're heterogeneous and they consisted primarily of programmable logic. Okay. Now, modern FPGAs, I think again for the last 5-6 years or so, they look more heterogeneous. So, this comes under the family of what we call a programmable SoC. So basically this has, a programmable logic, right? Including block RAM, ultra RAM, DSP, IOs, right? Transceivers, PCIe. And it also has a processing system. Again, this is not drawn to scale. So in reality, if you look at area, this is much, much smaller than this. But just to give you a sense of the functionality, right? So there are, we have architectures where there are ARM cores to do embedded processing. Okay. So there's one to do application processing in this. You can see there's one to do any real-time processing. So you can actually run a small OS on this. You have a built-in DDR memory. And then we have all kinds of configuration and security functions which are built in, high-speed connectivity blocks which are already hardened here. Right? So these kinds of SoCs are actually very, very effective for embedded applications, where you want to have some processing, right? Not very heavy duty processing. At the same time, you want to have the flexibility of using the programmable logic of an FPGA. So this allows you to run some host code on the ARM and connect very easily to the programmable logic here without going off the chip. So every time you go off the chip, you incur a high delay. So the purpose of these architectures is to target those types of applications. And they're very, very popular in embedded applications or, surveillance in cameras and things like that. So another flavor of SoC is what we call an RF SoC. This is targeted at communications applications. So here, you'll see in addition to this processing system, the programmable logic will also have hard blocks to process an RF signal chain. So you'll actually have analog digital converters, digital analog converters. You'll have a FEC block, which does forward error correction. And you have a lot of high-speed connectivity blocks. SerDes, Ethernet, MAC, and so on. Okay. So these are targeted at more of these communications applications where you need to do some amount of analog to digital processing. And here again, if you have the ability to do it on chip, you actually gain a lot in performance than if you had to go off chip, go to a separate ADC chip, and then do it. Then finally, we have Versal, which is the latest SoC which has come out from Xilinx. And actually more than an SoC, it's being touted as a full platform. And this is called an adaptive compute platform. Okay? And this really includes all kinds of blocks. So you have programmable block, and this includes a programmable network on the chip. So all your programmable logic is here. That's what we call adaptable engines. And then, you have embedded ARM cores, basically 4 ARM cores. You have a small controller that manages your platform. You have hardened memory controllers, hardened PCIe blocks. This is all to, connect to various things, whether it's MIPI to go to a camera or, a video decoder to connect to video. And then we have AI engines, which is really a small array of VLIW engines. And similarly, an array of DSP engines. So this is a kind of taking the programmable logic to another level. And, exactly which blocks are hardened and, what is the memory available and how's the communication between blocks. It's really built to enable more acceleration. So any questions?
Hi, I have a question regarding this AI engines. So you said there are VLIW instructions, right? So we work on the software abstraction layer, which automatically converts, say, a convolution 2D operation into the corresponding VLIW instructions, or there is even control over lower granularity of abstraction. In the sense, can we write lower level of operations, like in the sense Verilog?
No, this cannot be programmed using Verilog.
Okay.
This actually has a separate compiler, and it has its own instruction. It has its own language, actually. It has its own language. So there is a small API which allows you to program each VLIW engine. So you can kind of program at that API.
Okay, API granularity.
Yeah, and you have a graph abstraction which tells you how these different cores, right? Each engine is connected. Is data coming, streaming, and so on.
So it's a streaming architecture, is it?
It has the capability to stream, but it's not only a streaming architecture. It could be used for anything which is non-streaming also. You can, take 4 cores and connect them to build a function.
I see. Yeah. So all these APIs are open source, is it? I mean, in the sense, can we download the APIs from the Xilinx?
Yeah, so the thing is, you will not be able to use these unless you have access to a Versal device.
I see.
So everything that we are doing for this course actually is really an UltraScale Plus, because that is what is available on AWS.
Correct.
This is the newest product. It's just kind of coming out. So I wanted to show this because this is actually a kind of SoC which is targeted at acceleration.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it is built to enable acceleration, and that is why you've hardened.
Yeah, the PCIe and everything is
that has to get.
The DDR4. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, this is very ideal actually for if you want to accelerate, especially the latest applications, right? This is very, very ideal. I mean, you have PCIe, you have DDR4. You have pretty much like, if you want to just have an accelerator, just buy this. And then you have the ARMs as well for a complete system on chip solution.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. This DDR4, by the way, is not the memory, it's a controller.
Yeah. But the controller IP, right? Basically, yeah.
Right. Correct.
So then on your board. So can we then do you also have a development board where you have DDR memory put onto it and so on?
Right. That's right. Actually,
so this is a chip, right?
Sorry.
This is a chip, right? In the sense.
This is a chip. Yes, correct. This is a chip. This is not the board. This is a chip.
Correct. And Xilinx might be also giving development boards with this chip, right?
Correct. In fact, Xilinx is now also selling boards. So previously we were not in the business of selling boards, but with UltraScale Plus for, specifically for acceleration, we sell these boards called Alveo. So they have an UltraScale Plus device, and that's right. And you can actually attach it to a server. And and so, AWS, which is what we'll be using in this course, actually uses UltraScale Plus boards. I think Amazon had their own board. I don't remember exactly now. But, but basically it's an UltraScale Plus based board. So you won't have access to all this, but you have access to the whole software framework that allows you to easily accelerate something.
I see. Okay. And the software framework is translating, is it? Like, does it translate across boards or no? It doesn't. It's the same software framework across.
It should. I think if there is, sometimes there are some differences, but typically these frameworks are built so that it easily ports, right?
I see.
So that your code easily ports. Unless you write at a very low level, it should port.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? So this is kind of to give you a flavor of, how FPGA architectures have been evolving. So the next thing that I want to quickly touch on, I guess we're over time, I'll go through this fast, is the design automation flow. And this for Xilinx, we call it the Vivado Design Suite. Intel has a similar suite of tools which they call Quartus. So if you had a design which was in RTL, a hardware description language, at the register transfer level, you would go through all these steps, right? So you first synthesize the design, you run logic optimization, some power optimization, you do placement, do some physical synthesis, route the design, and then you may review the design and you iterate as needed. Right? And this is just a plug for our latest release, which actually incorporates machine learning in many of these algorithms and steps. So, you would keep iterating until you meet your performance, and then you program the device by writing the image on the device. And similarly, if you had HLS, which is through Vitis, you would basically go through this, optimize the circuit. Your input would be in C or C++, right? And it writes out RTL for you, which can then go through this flow. And this is something called dynamic function exchange or partial reconfiguration, which is very critical to the whole concept of accelerators. So I will maybe flip through this and we'll come back to it in more detail later. So basically what this allows you to do is you have a region of the design that does not change because it takes care of the communication with the host. And then you have regions of the design where you can put in your kernels. And it actually allows you to swap kernels in and out, depending on what your computation is. So this entire flow, right, and the capability to program parts of the device while the chip is running is what we call dynamic function exchange. And that's actually very, very important for the data center because, they like to swap workloads in and out, right? And this allows them to do that.
While running the board itself or while loading the image, we change the things?
No. So the design will be running. So while the design is running, you may swap out functionality here with some other functionality.
Okay.
And it is, of course, the user's responsibility to make sure that your functionality is partitioned in such a way that you can use this without affecting your output. But the capability to do that swapping is very much there.
Okay.
And I'll end with this picture here, right? So Vitis is what you will be using to basically develop your accelerators. And an accelerator basically is something that allows you to offload bottleneck computations from a CPU host to any connected chip. The goal is usually to improve performance. And this could be, the connected chip could be a GPU, it could be an FPGA, it could even be an ASIC in some cases. And so why do you accelerate? So this example kind of shows you the benefits that you get. So, this is a simple computer vision come AI application, which gives 6 frames per second when I run everything on a CPU. So if I just accelerate the AI part of it by bringing it onto an FPGA, I can improve my performance to 30 frames per second. Now, if I can, in addition, take this, pre-process step, which are a bunch of computer vision functions. This is really an image classification example. And, if I'm able to accelerate these, then I'm able to improve to 40 frames per second. And now if on top of this, I parallelize by instantiating multiple kernels, I'm able to further increase this to 60 frames per second. And if you were able to accelerate the post-process as well, you would get further benefits. Okay? And to go back to Vitis, so this is the stack of software tools that actually allows you to do this kind of trade-off and all seamlessly. I'll end here since we are out of time. So a quick show of hands actually, if you found the pace was okay, please raise your hand. No repercussions if you didn't find the pace okay. It's about half the class, right? So I'm going to clear this now. Lower all hands. Okay, please raise your hand if you felt the pain.